In June 1944, American soldiers captured a young man on the beaches of Normandy. They thought he was Japanese. He was not. He was Korean. His name was Yang Kyung-jong, and he had served consecutively and by force in the Imperial Japanese Army, the Soviet Red Army, and the German Wehrmacht. 3 armies, 3 continents. A single man dragged along by the tide of a conflict that no one anywhere on the planet could ignore. More than 60 million dead. 6 continents involved. Entire economies destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again. The political map of the world rewritten in blood. The boundaries between state and crime erased. The word genocide coined to describe something that had no name because it had never happened before on such a scale. This is not the story of a war. It is the story of the moment when humanity confronted its own limits, and what it found on the other side of that boundary forever changed what we are. The roots of a broken world, the origins of the conflict. Europe did not stumble into war on September 1st, 1939. It was something that had been prepared for a long time, slowly and with anger. The First World War had killed 10 million young men and drawn borders with an arbitrariness that planted the seeds of future catastrophes. The historian A.J.P. Taylor expressed it precisely. The First World War explains the Second, and to a large extent caused it. Germany went to war in 1939 specifically to reverse the verdict of 1918 and destroy the peace agreements that had sealed it. That wound had not closed. It was festering. The officers of the old Kaiser's army, who in 1914 wore ceremonial uniforms and believed in the order of the world, were left wearing the worn-out clothes of unemployed men in a republic they did not respect. The Treaty of Versailles imposed a war guilt clause on Germany and reparations that the country could not pay, and that many Germans, including left-wing intellectuals, considered deeply unjust. The debt was so crushing that it generated what in German was called the Dolchstoß, the stab in the back, a conspiracy that never existed but that provided an emotionally satisfying explanation for defeat to millions of people who needed someone to blame. On that poisoned ground, Adolf Hitler grew. He was not the only candidate. There were other demagogues, other parties, other fantasies of national greatness, but Hitler had something the others did not. Historian Ian Kershaw described it as his extraordinary ability to embody what Germans wanted to project outward. His greatest talent was not oratory, although he was powerful in that regard. It was his ability to detect and exploit the weakness of his adversaries. When German conservatives believed they could control him, that he was useful but manageable, it was already too late. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. From that afternoon onward, he began dismantling the rule of law with a speed that stunned those who underestimated him. The Gestapo, unlike Stalin's secret police, did not need a massive network of informants because German society collaborated voluntarily. Neighbors denounced neighbors, colleagues denounced colleagues. Terror becomes externalized when ideology sustains it. The persecution of the Jews advanced in stages. First came legal humiliation. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped them of German citizenship and banned mixed marriages. Then came systematic harassment in commerce, in professions, and in everyday life. Hitler had told Joseph Goebbels in the early years, "The Jews must leave Germany, yes, all of Europe." But until the end of the 1930s, official policy was expulsion through exhaustion, not physical extermination. The night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, changed something in public perception. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, was a coordinated wave of violence against Jews throughout Germany and Austria. Synagogues burned, businesses destroyed, nearly 100 deaths recorded during the night, and tens of thousands sent to concentration camps in the following days. Hermann Göring complained, with cynical coldness, that there had been so much material destruction that it had to be compensated through insurance. The massacre seemed to him an economic waste. Murder as a category no longer caused outrage. What irritated him was inefficiency. Abroad, France and Britain had spent almost a decade systematically surrendering to every one of Hitler's demands. The occupation of the Rhineland in 1936, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, provoked no response. The annexation of Austria in March 1938 did not either. The Munich Agreement in September of that year, where Neville Chamberlain accepted handing over the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia in exchange for a promise of peace, was the culmination of a strategy based on a mistaken calculation that Hitler had limited and rational objectives. Winston Churchill was one of the few who clearly saw what was happening. He paid for it with years of political exclusion. In Britain, he was considered a dangerous warmonger, an irresponsible maverick. The press, dominated by those who supported appeasement, ignored or attacked him. And Chamberlain, upon returning from Munich with that piece of paper promising peace for our time, was received as a hero. 6 months later, in March 1939, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia without anyone having agreed to it. This time, there were no German minorities to protect, no ethnic argument to invoke. It was naked conquest. Only then did Chamberlain understand that he had made a fundamental mistake, and he extended guarantees to Poland. But the darkest piece on the board was still missing. On August 23, 1939, the world received the news of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression agreement. Two ideologies that proclaimed themselves mortal enemies had reached an agreement. Communist militants across half of Europe were left disoriented, and the Poles understood that their country was doomed. The pact contained a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Stalin claimed the Baltic states, the eastern half of Poland, Finland, and Bessarabia. He toasted Hitler, who in return received security for his eastern flank, allowing him to attack the West without the risk of a two-front war. It was a cynical transaction of historic proportions, and both men knew it was temporary. Each planned to devour the other at the appropriate moment. On September 1st, 1939, 1.5 million German soldiers crossed the Polish border. Hitler invoked in the Reichstag Polish provocations that were fabrications. One of the alleged Polish aggressions had been carried out by prisoners from a German concentration camp dressed in Polish uniforms, who were then murdered so they could not testify. The scene was staged for the press and for history. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Something began for which the world still had neither the concepts nor the language. The fall of Western Europe, Blitzkrieg and the collapse of France, May 9, 1940, was a beautiful spring day in Northern Europe. In Brussels, Belgian soldiers were planting flowers around their barracks. In Paris, cafes were full, and the trees of the Bois de Boulogne had burst into bloom. The most popular song on French radio was J'attendrai, I Will Wait, performed without any apparent irony. The following day, May 10th, the Wehrmacht simultaneously invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg and France. The German strategy, Erich von Manstein's plan known as Sichelschnitt, the sickle cut, was daring to the point of appearing suicidal on paper. While the northern armies pushed the Allied forces toward Belgium, exactly what General Maurice Gamelin expected, the bulk of the German armoured divisions would move through the Ardennes forest, a region the French considered impenetrable for tanks. General Hunziker had requested more reinforcements for that sector, and Gamelin had refused them. The German General Heinz Guderian, commander of the 19th Panzer Corps, crossed the Luxembourg border at 4:30 hours on May 10th. His tanks advanced along forest tracks beneath a canopy of beech, fir and oak trees that concealed them from Allied aircraft. Each vehicle carried a small white K painted on it to identify its belonging to Kleist's forces and to guarantee absolute priority on the roads. German logistics were brutal in their precision. Any disabled vehicle was pushed off the road without consideration. General Erwin Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, reached the Meuse River near Dinant on May 13th. The French guards resisted well. Rommel, travelling in an 8-wheeled armoured vehicle, went personally to assess the situation. His troops had no smoke shells, so he ordered houses to be set on fire in the direction of the wind in order to create smoke screens. He ordered his Mark IV tanks to fire on French positions to cover the crossing with rubber boats. And when French tanks appeared without warning, Rommel ordered his men who had no anti-tank weapons to fire signal flares. The French crews, convinced they were armor-piercing projectiles, withdrew. Rommel's legend was born during those 48 hours. To the south, in the Sedan sector, the situation was different. The Junkers 87 dive bombers, the Stukas, with their Jericho trumpets that produced a terrifying howl as they descended, destroyed French artillery positions with a precision the Allies had not expected. The French reserve divisions, many of them survivors of the First World War who did not want to die in another war they considered unjust, collapsed. One officer recorded that soldiers fled, shouting that the German tanks were already on the other side of the river when that had not yet happened. The French commander-in-chief, General Gamelin, learned of the breakthrough in the Sedan front only at dusk on May 13th. When Churchill flew to Paris on May 16th to meet with Prime Minister Paul Reynaud and Gamelin at the Quai d'Orsay, he found a scene of total collapse. Ministry officials were burning files in bonfires in the courtyards. The windows of the offices were spewing papers that the wind scattered across the neighborhood. "Where is the strategic reserve?" Churchill asked, looking at the map where a bulge marked the German breakthrough. Gamelin shrugged. Aucune. None. By May 20th, the Austrian 2nd Panzer Division had reached Abbeville and the mouth of the Somme River on the English Channel. The Sichelschnitt plan had been accomplished. The Allied forces in Belgium, the British Expeditionary Force, the First French Army, and the Belgians were surrounded. More than 400,000 soldiers were trapped in the Dunkirk pocket. What followed? The evacuation of Dunkirk between May 26th and June 4th, during which 338,000 soldiers crossed the Channel aboard 861 vessels of all kinds, from naval destroyers to fishing boats, was presented in Britain as a miracle. Winston Churchill, more honestly, told the House of Commons that wars are not won by evacuations. But the survival of the British Army made it possible to continue the war. France surrendered on June 22, 1940. The armistice was signed in the same railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, where Germany had signed its surrender in 1918. Hitler ordered the railway carriage destroyed afterward. He wanted to erase the physical symbol of the previous humiliation. In 6 weeks, the continental power that had endured 4 years in the trenches of the Great War had collapsed. It was, in the words of historian Anthony Beevor, a miracle for the German army and a civilizational catastrophe for Europe. Britain alone. The Battle of Britain and the Doctrine of Perseverance. Britain in the summer of 1940 stood alone against the most powerful and aggressive regime that Europe had produced in centuries. France had fallen. The Soviet Union had a pact with Berlin. The United States was formally neutral and politically reluctant to intervene. Mussolini had just declared war on the Allies in order not to miss out on the division of the spoils. Nazi domination stretched from Norway to the Pyrenees. Winston Churchill arrived at 10 Downing Street on May 10th, the same day the German attack in the West began, after Neville Chamberlain was overthrown in a famous parliamentary vote following the fiasco of the Norwegian campaign. The speech Churchill delivered before the House of Commons on May 13th contained a phrase that would resonate for decades. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." The real proposal Churchill brought was different from that of any European leader of his time: to resist indefinitely, not to seek peace terms, and to drag the United States into the conflict. In May 1940, while the Germans were surrounding Allied forces in Belgium, Churchill told his son Randolph, with his razor still in his hand, "I am going to drag the United States into the war." Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, pressured the War Cabinet to explore mediation through Mussolini. Churchill blocked that path with a clarity that some considered stubbornness and others the only rational decision available. If Britain negotiated, he told his ministers, the entire empire would lose its will to fight, and once that will was lost, it would never return. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940. The Luftwaffe, under the command of Marshal Hermann Göring, first attempted to destroy British naval aviation over the Channel, then the ports, and finally the RAF's fighter command. The most dangerous phase came in August, when the Germans concentrated their attacks on RAF bases in southeastern England. RAF pilots, many of them Polish, Czech, Canadian and Australian, in addition to British pilots, flew up to 5 missions a day. Several died in the first week of combat, before gaining the experience that increased their chances of survival. A German mistake saved Britain. On August 24th, German bombers accidentally dropped bombs on London, violating Hitler's restriction against attacking the capital, and Churchill ordered retaliatory strikes against Berlin. Göring, furious and wounded in his pride, changed the Luftwaffe's objective. Instead of attacking fighter command bases, it began bombing London. The Blitz would kill more than 43,000 British civilians in the following months, but it allowed the RAF to recover and reorganize. By September 1940, Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, was postponed indefinitely. Hitler never crossed the Channel. But something more was at stake at that moment, beyond British survival alone. John Keegan expressed it in his analysis. The victory in the Battle of Britain was the first defeat of Nazi Germany. It demonstrated that the regime was vulnerable. It gave the world time to organize itself. And, crucially, it kept Britain as a platform from which any future counter-offensive against occupied Europe would be possible. Without that platform, there is no Dunkirk. Without Dunkirk, there is no army to rebuild. Without that army, there is no Normandy in 1944. Everything hangs on that summer of 1940 and on Churchill's decision not to negotiate. Barbarossa, the largest military confrontation in history. This is a war of extermination, Hitler told his generals on March 30, 1941, 2.5 months before launching Operation Barbarossa. It was not a rhetorical exaggeration, it was an operational directive. On June 22, 1941, 3 German army groups, North, Center and South, crossed the Soviet border with 3.8 million men, 3,350 tanks and nearly 2,700 aircraft. It was the largest military operation in human history up to that date. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad, Center toward Moscow, South toward Kiev and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Stalin, despite dozens of warnings from his own spies, the British government, American ambassadors, and even German defectors who crossed the border in the hours before the attack, refused to believe that Hitler would break the pact. He ordered that the Germans not be provoked. When the attack began, the Soviet Air Force was destroyed on the ground. 225 airfields were attacked in the first hours. More than 1,200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the first day, most of them without ever taking off. Red Army soldiers found themselves in an organizational chaos of catastrophic proportions. Stalin's purges in 1937 and 1938 had eliminated 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army generals, and 50 out of 57 corps generals. The young officers who replaced them knew that any independent initiative, even in the face of an obvious emergency, could be interpreted as disloyalty and cost them their lives. Stalin had ordered that surrender constituted treason. The families of captured soldiers were arrested. Surrender was, in many cases, a choice between 2 deaths. During the first weeks, disasters accumulated with a speed that overwhelmed comprehension. In the Battle of Kiev, completed in September 1941, Army Group South captured more than 665,000 Soviet soldiers. In the Battle of Bryansk and Vyazma between October and November, another 663,000. The numbers were so enormous that the Germans had no facilities capable of holding so many prisoners. They began dying of hunger, cold, and disease in open-air camps. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, more than 2 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German hands. in what historian Christian Streit documented as a deliberate policy of extermination through starvation. But the Red Army, despite everything, did not collapse. There were factors that German planners had failed to properly calculate. Soviet territory was vast beyond any European frame of reference. German supplies had to travel across increasingly long communication lines. The Soviet railway system used a different gauge from the European one, complicating logistics. And the Russian winter of 1941 arrived with temperatures of -40 degrees Celsius for German troops who lacked proper equipment because Hitler had promised that the campaign would be finished before autumn. On December 5, 1941, General Georgy Zhukov launched the Soviet counter-offensive before Moscow with more than 1 million newly equipped men, many brought from Siberia. Soldiers accustomed to extreme cold, equipped with sleds, felt Valenki boots and white winter uniforms. The German divisions facing the capital, exhausted and frozen, retreated. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was forced into a withdrawal. It was the beginning of something different. The Eastern Front would become, between 1941 and 1945, the longest, most destructive and deadliest theatre of operations in human history. Its battles would consume more lives than all other fronts combined, and it would determine the outcome of the entire war. The Holocaust, the industrialization of murder. Vasily Grossman, the Soviet journalist and novelist who followed the Red Army from Moscow to Berlin, identified the central distinction, what he called the Holocaust by bullets and the Holocaust by gas, the two arms of the same machine. When Operation Barbarossa began, 4 special SS units, the Einsatzgruppen, totaling approximately 3,000 men, followed the army groups into Soviet territory. But the true scale of the killing apparatus was greater. 11,000 men of the Ordnungspolizei, the order police, operated in waves behind the troops as a second force. SS cavalry brigades and other Waffen-SS groups completed the picture. The instructions of Reinhard Heydrich, Heinrich Himmler's deputy, were formally more restrictive than what occurred in practice. The Einsatzgruppen were to eliminate Communist Party officials, commissars, and Jews in positions within the party and the state. But the logic of terror has its own gravitational pull. What began with adult males in positions of power expanded, within weeks, to all Jewish men of military age, then to all Jewish men regardless of age, and finally to women and children. On August 15, 1941, Himmler personally attended the execution of 100 Jews near Minsk, a spectacle he had organized at his own request. He was unable to watch. Afterwards, he spoke with Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, who noted that only 100 people had been shot that day. He pointed to the eyes of the commando men and said to Himmler, "What kind of followers are we creating?" Bach-Zelewski, who suffered from nightmares and chronic stomach pains, was sent to recover in a sanatorium. Himmler, sensitive to the psychological effect on the executioners, sought more efficient methods. The use of explosives was tested, a chaotic disaster. Then gas vans using carbon monoxide from engine exhaust were tried. Afterwards, in September 1941, at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Zyklon B, an insecticide developed by the IG Farben Chemical Consortium, was used for the first time on Soviet and Polish prisoners. The test was considered successful. By the end of 1942, the Einsatzgruppen, police battalions and anti-partisan units had murdered more than 1.35 million people, the overwhelming majority of them Jews. The next step was the bureaucratic formalization of total extermination. On January 20, 1942, in a villa on the shore of Lake Wannsee, on the outskirts of Berlin, 15 senior Nazi officials met for approximately 90 minutes. The conference, chaired by Heydrich and organized by Adolf Eichmann, coordinated the implementation of the final solution of the Jewish question in Europe. The surviving documents, only one protocol from the Foreign Ministry, list 11 million European Jews as the target. Representatives from different ministries and occupation structures calmly discussed the logistics of industrial mass murder in bureaucratic terms. The extermination camps were already operating or under construction when the Wannsee Conference took place. Chelmno had begun operations in December 1941. Bełżec, Treblinka and Sobibor opened in 1942. Treblinka, in eastern occupied Poland, had no medical selection, no factories, and no purpose beyond immediate murder. Those who arrived by train were taken directly to the gas chambers. The period between leaving the train and death rarely exceeded 2 hours. Auschwitz-Birkenau, southwest of Krakow, was the largest center. Zyklon B was introduced through openings in the ceilings of the gas chambers. After the murders, the prisoners of the Sonderkommando, Jews forced to perform this labor under the threat of immediate death, removed the bodies, extracted gold dental fillings and hair, which were used industrially. Some bodies provided raw materials for soap at the Anatomical Medical Institute in Danzig. Professor Rudolf Spanner documented the process. The total number of Jews murdered in the Holocaust is approximately 5.4 to 6 million. 100,000 Roma were murdered in the same facilities. 120,000 or more people with mental or physical disabilities had already been exterminated beforehand through the T4 program, which was precisely the technical and bureaucratic laboratory upon which the machinery of the camps was built. Vasily Grossman, who entered Treblinka in 1944 and Auschwitz in 1945 with the Red Army, wrote, "It is the duty of the writer to tell this terrible thing." He added something that no statistic could capture. In his view, the duty of survivors was to recognize individuals among the millions of ghosts from the mass graves, not dehumanized categories, because that dehumanization was precisely what the perpetrators had sought to achieve. The Holocaust was not a side consequence of the war, it was central to the ideology that unleashed it. Without Hitler, there is no Second World War, and without the Second World War as cover, Hitler signed his euthanasia order retroactively dated September 1st, 1939, the day of the invasion of Poland, precisely in order to use the war as an excuse. Industrialized extermination would not have been possible. Pearl Harbor and the War in the Pacific, when the world became a battlefield. On December 7, 1941, at 7:53 hours, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida issued the coded words "Tora, Tora, Tora, Tiger, Tiger, Tiger" from his bomber flying over Pearl Harbor. It meant that the element of surprise had been complete. The Japanese naval force, consisting of 6 aircraft carriers and 183 aircraft in the first wave, destroyed or damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed 188 aircraft, and left 2,402 dead in the attack. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had planned the operation, wrote in his diary that night, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant." He was right. Imperial Japan had spent the previous decade building a vast empire in East Asia. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931, which some Asian historians consider the true beginning of the Second World War, was the first step. The war against China, formally begun in 1937 after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, produced atrocities on a scale that few people in the West knew about at the time. In Nanking, between December 1937 and January 1938, units of the Imperial Japanese Army murdered between 40,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and surrendered soldiers in 6 weeks. The figures remain disputed by Japanese historiography, but the testimonies of foreign witnesses present in the city, including German diplomats and Western businessmen, leave no doubt about the scale and nature of the crimes. The Japanese strategy in December 1941 was both brilliant and fundamentally flawed. Yamamoto understood that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. The only opportunity was to strike so hard and so quickly that Washington would accept a negotiated peace, recognizing Japanese dominance in the Western Pacific. The admiral had lived in the United States, studied at Harvard, and knew American industrial capacity better than any other officer in the Imperial Navy. What he failed to calculate, what nobody in Tokyo calculated, was the nature of the American political response. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's speech before Congress the following day was as brief as it was devastating. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Congress declared war within hours. 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States, freeing Roosevelt from the political limitations that had prevented him from intervening in Europe. It was the most costly strategic mistake Hitler made during the war, and he made it voluntarily. The Pacific Campaign between 1942 and 1945 was an amphibious war unprecedented in scale and ferocity. Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island was a massacre. The Japanese did not surrender. Their military values and indoctrination considered surrender an unbearable disgrace. At Guadalcanal, between August 1942 and February 1943, the Japanese lost approximately 24,000 dead out of a total of 36,000 troops on the island. The Americans lost around 7,000, ratios that would be repeated. The Battle of Midway from June 4th to June 7th, 1942, was the turning point in the Pacific. American cryptographers had broken Japanese codes and knew the objective of the attack. In 4 minutes of dive-bombing attacks, American naval aircraft sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with most of their most experienced pilots. Japan lost in that week an air and naval capability that it could not replace. The war in the Pacific changed direction. In the Philippines, on the Bataan Peninsula, more than 75,000 captured American and Filipino soldiers in April 1942 were forced to march more than 100 kilometers under a heat of 38 degrees Celsius. Without water, without food, with guards who killed those who fell behind with bayonets. The Bataan Death March killed between 5,000 and 18,000 Filipinos and between 500 and 650 Americans. For American soldiers who had grown up believing in the invulnerability of their country, it was a brutal revelation. The North African Front and the Desert Wars. While Europe was burning, while the Soviet Union was bleeding, while the Pacific was becoming the scene of an unprecedented naval war, the desert of North Africa became another theatre of operations that, although smaller in terms of total casualties, was strategically decisive. Italy had declared war on Great Britain and France on June 10, 1940, calculating that both were only a short time away from collapsing completely. Mussolini wanted his share of the spoils, but the Italian army in Libya proved to be a much weaker adversary than expected. Operation Compass, launched by General Richard O'Connor in December 1940 with the British 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats, virtually destroyed the Italian 10th Army in 2 months. More than 130,000 prisoners were taken. Hitler had to intervene. In February 1941, the Afrika Korps arrived in Tripoli under the command of General-Lieutenant Erwin Rommel, the same general who had crossed the Meuse River in France 9 months earlier. Rommel transformed the Desert War. Within 2 days, he had launched a counterattack when he was supposed to spend weeks organizing. His style of command, moving personally with the frontline troops, assessing the terrain himself, making decisions on the battlefield, baffled his German superiors just as much as it did the British. The exchange of territory in North Africa, Cyrenaica changing hands 2 or 3 times, culminated with the fall of Tobruk in June 1942, one of Britain's most serious humiliations throughout the entire war. 33,000 soldiers, including the South African garrison, surrendered. Churchill learned the news while he was meeting with Roosevelt at the White House. An American general who was present immediately offered to send Sherman tanks to Egypt. Rommel was promoted to General Feldmarschall. He was 49 years old, but El Alamein, in October 1942, was different. General Bernard Montgomery had reorganized the British Eighth Army with almost obsessive meticulousness. Night attacks, cutting-edge engineering operations to open breaches through minefields, and air superiority established before committing the infantry. After 12 days of fighting, the Afrika Korps was decisively broken. Rommel, ill and in Germany during part of the battle, returned too late. The Allied landing in North Africa, Operation Torch, on November 8, 1942, opened a second front. In Tunisia, for the first time, American soldiers faced the Wehrmacht in serious combat. The first experience was traumatic. At Kasserine, in February 1943, the inexperienced American divisions suffered a severe defeat. But they learned quickly. In May 1943, more than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. It was the largest Axis capitulation since Stalingrad 3 months earlier. North Africa was also the battlefield where the alliances developed their most ruthless pragmatism. The United States reached an agreement with Admiral Jean-François Darlan, a Vichy collaborator, to facilitate the landing. The moral outrage was considerable. Darlan was assassinated on December 24, 1942, by a young French monarchist with connections to the British SOE. The details of the plot were never fully clarified, and the problem remained unresolved, but without leaving behind an uncomfortable martyr. The war in Africa, viewed from today, fulfilled a crucial strategic function. It trained the Allied armies, especially the American one, to confront the Wehrmacht. Without that training, the Normandy landings would have been a completely different kind of catastrophe. Stalingrad, the turning point. On November 21, 1942, General Friedrich Paulus and his chief of staff flew away in the last 2 Fieseler Storch aircraft available to them in order to escape the tightening encirclement closing around the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Operation Uranus, a massive double envelopment coordinated by Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, had sealed the trap around more than 290,000 men on the banks of the Volga. When Hitler learned where Paulus was, he accused him of abandoning his troops and ordered him to return to the front. Paulus obeyed. Hermann Göring assured the Führer that the Luftwaffe could supply the Sixth Army by air. His own transport officers had told him that the maximum possible amount was 350 tons per day, and only for a short period. The Sixth Army needed 700 tons. Göring promised 500. The promise was false. Thus, he sealed the fate of 250,000 men. The Kessel, the cauldron, surrounding Stalingrad, had the shape of a crushed skull, the forehead at the city, the rest stretching into the steppe, 60 kilometers long and 40 kilometers wide. The German soldiers called it with bitter humor, the fortress without a roof. The rations, already insufficient before the encirclement, were drastically reduced. The men spent their days digging trenches in frozen ground, unable to fit their swollen, frostbitten fingers into the trigger guards of their weapons. The forensic doctor, Hans Georgensohn, sent by air into the Kessel in December 1942 to investigate the increase in deaths, performed 50 autopsies. His conclusion was terrifying. The soldiers were dying of starvation at a much faster rate than expected under ordinary starvation conditions. Chronic stress, extreme cold, lack of sleep, and prolonged malnutrition interacted, destroying the body's metabolism. The organism consumed its reserves at a speed that allowed no recovery, even with minimal food intake. In the field hospital tents, the blood from open wounds froze before surgeons could stitch them. Gangrenous limbs caused by frostbite were amputated without anesthesia. There was none left, with saws or even pliers. "The German soldier suffers and dies with courage and without complaints," wrote the chaplain of the 305th Infantry Division. "Even the amputees remain calm." On Christmas Eve of 1942, inside bunkers beneath the snow, soldiers sang Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night, Holy Night. Many cried as they thought of their families. But that emotional generosity did not extend to the Soviet prisoners held in 2 camps inside the Kessel. Deprived of all food so as not to reduce German rations, the few survivors eventually resorted to eating the bodies of their dead comrades. On January 8, 1943, The Don Front sent 2 emissaries under a white flag to offer surrender terms to Paulus. They were rejected, probably on the orders of his chief of staff. On January 10th, Operation Ring began. 47 Soviet divisions with 300 aircraft attacked the perimeter. Ravens circled overhead and descended to tear out the eyes of both the dead and the dying. On January 31st, 1943, soldiers of the Red Army entered the basement of the Univermag department store building in Red Square in Stalingrad. Paulus, exhausted, with a nervous twitch in his left cheek, psychologically broken, surrendered to the Soviets. Hitler had promoted him to General Feldmarschall the previous day in a coded message intended to pressure him into suicide. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus did not give him that satisfaction. On February 2nd, General Strecker surrendered the final remnants of the 11th Corps in northern Stalingrad. The Red Army discovered that it had 91,000 prisoners in its hands, far more than expected. Due to a lack of preparation, many died of starvation and disease before any assistance arrived. Nearly half of the 91,000 had died by spring. Total Soviet losses throughout the entire Stalingrad campaign reached 1.1 million, of whom nearly 500,000 were killed. The Axis powers, Germany, Romania, Italy and Hungary, lost more than 500,000 men between dead and captured. In Germany, radio stations were ordered to broadcast solemn music. Goebbels attempted to construct a heroic myth. They died so that Germany could live. But news of the 91,000 captured soldiers was already circulating through the BBC and German homes with clandestine radios. The shock was decisive. Only the most fanatical believers continued to think the war could be won. Stalingrad was the first great moment when the German illusion of invincibility was destroyed beyond any possibility of reconstruction. The Eastern Front, which until then had seemed like a settled matter, revealed its true nature, a struggle between civilizations that would last until the last man. The fall of Italian fascism and the Italian campaign. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces, American, British and Canadian, landed in Sicily in the largest amphibious operation carried out up to that point in the European theatre. The island fell in 38 days. It was a victory, but a victory that revealed Allied dysfunctions with disturbing clarity. The rivalry between General George Patton and Bernard Montgomery consumed energies that should have been devoted to cutting off the German retreat routes. In Rome, the Sicilian defeat precipitated the coup d'état that Mussolini had not expected. On the night of July 25th, the Grand Council of Fascism voted for his removal by 19 votes to 8. Mussolini was arrested as he left the meeting with King Victor Emmanuel III and was sent to a villa at Gran Sasso in the Apennines. Hitler, upon learning the news, initially refused to believe it. Then he flew into a rage. On September 8, 1943, Marshal Pietro Badoglio announced the armistice with the Allies. Before the Italians could act in coordination with the Allies to secure key positions, the German divisions in Italy, which Hitler had reinforced in anticipation of this scenario, disarmed the Italian army and occupied the country. In Rome, the German order was carried out within hours. Italian soldiers who resisted were executed by firing squad. Marshal Badoglio and the king fled south. The SS Hauptsturmführer Otto Skorzeny carried out a spectacular rescue operation on September 12th. His gliders landed on the summit of Gran Sasso, freed Mussolini and transported him to Hitler. The Duce, aged, defeated, and lacking any will of his own, was installed as head of the Italian Social Republic, a puppet state in northern Italy. Mussolini ruled the final 2 years of his life as a prisoner of his own allies. The Italian campaign became a nightmare of rugged terrain and tenacious German resistance. General Albert Kesselring proved to be one of the masters of defensive warfare in the 20th century. The Gustav Line, which crossed Italy from coast to coast, halted the Allied advance for months. The Battle of Monte Cassino, the 6th-century Benedictine monastery that dominated the only practicable route through the mountains, lasted from January to May 1944, with 4 assaults and tens of thousands of casualties. The Allied bombing that destroyed the monastery on February 15, 1944, was a tactical mistake that strengthened the German defensive position as they used the rubble as superior trench material. Italy served Allied strategy as what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. The concept was never as soft in reality as it was in the metaphor. However, it forced Hitler to keep 22 divisions in Italy that otherwise would have been available on the Eastern Front or in Normandy. D-Day, the most complex military operation in history. On June 5, 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower wrote a handwritten message that was never sent. It was a letter assuming full responsibility for the failure of the operation that was about to begin within hours. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Le Havre area have failed to secure a satisfactory position, and I have withdrawn the troops, it stated. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air forces, and the Navy did everything that courage and devotion to duty could accomplish. If there is any blame or fault in the attempt, it is mine alone. The letter remained in his pocket. The operation succeeded. Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings of June 6, 1944, was the most complex operation in military history up to that point. It involved 156,000 soldiers landing on the beaches on the first day, 11,590 aircraft, 6,080 of them combat aircraft, and nearly 7,000 vessels of all types. Planning took almost 2 years. The deception, Operation Bodyguard, designed to convince the Germans that the real invasion would take place at the Strait of Calais, was a masterpiece of intelligence and misinformation involving double agents, phantom armies, and false radio transmissions. In the early hours of June 6th, in complete darkness, C-47 transport aircraft dropped the paratroopers of the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions deep inside Normandy. Their mission was to capture bridges, key roads, and the western end of the beachhead. Many landed in the wrong areas, scattered across 100 square kilometers. But that very dispersion confused the German defenders, who were unable to identify the pattern of the attack. At 6:30 hours, the amphibious assault began. 5 beaches, 5 different armies and national forces, Utah and Omaha, the Americans, Sword, Juno, and Gold, the British and Canadians. Utah was relatively calm. Omaha was hell. The American infantry divisions attacking Omaha faced a series of accumulated disasters. The landing craft arrived in the wrong direction because of the currents. The DD tanks, duplex drive vehicles designed to float, almost all sank before reaching the shore. Of the 29 launched into the sea, only 2 reached the beach. The B-24 aircraft that were supposed to bomb the German positions released their bombs too late far inland. The naval demolition teams, whose task was to disable underwater obstacles, were cut down by MG-42 machine gun fire. During the first hour, the American 1st Infantry Division suffered more than 50% casualties among the first assault waves. The bodies of the dead floated among the soldiers trying to advance. General Omar Bradley seriously considered abandoning the beach and redirecting the following waves toward Utah, but the men moved forward. Individuals, small groups, sergeants and captains without an operational plan, acting on instinct or desperation, began climbing the cliffs or finding exits along the sides of the beach. By the end of the day, the Americans had established a position on Omaha, precarious and blood-soaked, but a position nonetheless. At the same time, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded the coastal defenses, was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday. He had predicted that the invasion would not take place that day because of the bad weather. Hitler was asleep at Berchtesgaden, and his aides did not dare wake him. The 2 panzer divisions that could have reached the beaches within hours remained inactive because no one had the authority to move them without the Führer's order. It was one of the most costly mistakes made by the Axis throughout the entire war. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, 156,115 Allied soldiers were on French soil. Total casualties on the first day were approximately 10,000, of whom 4,414 were confirmed dead. The exact number remains a subject of debate. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. Bagration and the destruction of the German Army Group Center. While the Allies were consolidating their beachheads in Normandy in June 1944, something was happening on the Eastern Front that eclipsed everything else in absolute scale. On June 23, 1944, the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, named after the 19th-century Georgian general Pyotr Bagration, who was killed at Borodino, against the German Army Group Center. The operation was designed by Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky and coordinated with simultaneous attacks in the south. It involved 2.4 million Soviet soldiers, 5,200 tanks, and 5,300 aircraft. 4 German armies totaling around 800,000 men were the target. Within 12 days, Army Group Center was destroyed. 28 German divisions were annihilated or captured. Total German casualties during the 2 months of the operation exceeded 400,000 dead and wounded, with between 150,000 and 200,000 taken prisoner. It was Germany's greatest military defeat of the entire war, greater than Stalingrad in terms of the destruction of operational divisions. On July 17, 1944, columns of German prisoners were paraded through the streets of Moscow. 57,000 men marched for hours. The Muscovite women who watched them had lost husbands, sons, and fathers in the war. There were insults and objects thrown from the sidewalks, but also, according to some witnesses, moments of compassion. Women who threw bread to the prisoners. The Soviet summer offensive of 1944 advanced more than 500 kilometers westward, bringing the Red Army to the borders of eastern Poland. Warsaw was within reach, and in Warsaw, on August 1, 1944, the Polish Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising. The political calculation of the uprising's leaders, who depended on the Polish government in exile in London, was to liberate the capital before the arrival of the Soviets in order to establish a political position that would allow them to negotiate. The Red Army, which was 80 kilometers away, stopped. Stalin was not interested in an independent Poland. He rejected the British and American request to allow Allied aircraft carrying supplies to land at Soviet airfields in order to supply the uprising from the air. For 2 months, the Poles fought house by house in Warsaw with insufficient weapons, without outside support under systematic German bombardment. The SS forces of General Bach-Zelewski reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. On October 2, 1944, General Tadeusz Bohr-Komorowski signed the surrender. The Germans deported the remaining civilian population and then methodically destroyed 85% of the city, building by building, as retaliation. When Soviet troops entered Warsaw in January 1945, they found ruins. The Ardennes and the final collapse of Germany. On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 hours, the largest concentration of German artillery since the beginning of the war opened fire on the American lines in the Belgian Ardennes. 2 million shells were fired in the first hours. In the fog and snow of that winter dawn, 3 German armies, including the 6th SS Panzer Army under Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, advanced against the thinnest section of the American front held by 8 divisions that were not expecting any major attack. Hitler was betting everything on this offensive, which he called Wacht am Rhein, Guard on the Rhine, with the objective of reaching Antwerp and cutting the Allied supply lines, forcing Great Britain and the United States into negotiations. It was a desperate calculation. The resources consumed in it, 600 tanks, 1,900 aircraft, 500 million liters of fuel that Germany could no longer replace, were the Reich's last strategic assets. The Battle of the Ardennes caused the greatest American casualties of any campaign of the war. 75,000 wounded, 8,000 killed, and 21,000 captured during the first weeks. At Malmedy, German soldiers of the 1st SS Panzer Division massacred 84 American prisoners of war on December 17th. The news spread throughout the Allied front with the opposite effect to what the Nazis had intended. It hardened the resistance. The American 101st Airborne Division, surrounded at Bastogne, a vital road junction, resisted the siege under the command of General Anthony McAuliffe. When the Germans sent an ultimatum demanding surrender, McAuliffe replied with a single word: nuts. Something roughly equivalent to hell with you or no way. The Germans needed an interpreter to understand that it was a rejection. The weather cleared on December 23rd. 800 transport aircraft dropped supplies over Bastogne, and Allied fighters began punishing the German columns on the roads. General George Patton, in a maneuver that his own officers considered impossible, turned the Third Army 90 degrees northward within 48 hours and opened a corridor toward Bastogne on December 26th. By mid-January 1945, the German bulge in the front line, the bulge that gave the battle its name, had been eliminated. Germany had lost its last offensive resource. The road to the Rhine was open. On January 22, 1945, the Red Army crossed the Vistula River and began the most powerful offensive of the war, with 5 fronts and more than 2.2 million soldiers. Within 10 days they reached the Oder River, only 60 kilometers from Berlin. The Reich that Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years had only days left. In Berlin, Hitler lived in the underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. His final weeks were a delirium of movements of divisions that no longer existed, of orders that nobody obeyed or that nobody was capable of carrying out. When SS commanders informed him of reality, he exploded in rage against the betrayal of his generals, his people, and everyone except himself. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet soldiers only a few blocks away from the bunker, Adolf Hitler shot himself in the right temple. He was 56 years old. Eva Braun, whom he had married the previous night in a 20-minute bureaucratic ceremony, took cyanide. The bodies were burned in the garden of the Reich Chancellery according to Hitler's explicit instructions, as he did not want to suffer the same fate as Mussolini, who had been hung upside down at a gas station in Milan 3 days earlier. On May 8, 1945, General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel signed Germany's unconditional surrender before representatives of the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France. The war in Europe was over. The war in East Asia, the collapse of Japan. At the beginning of 1945, the Japanese Empire still controlled vast areas of East Asia and the Pacific on paper. In reality, its position was untenable. The Imperial Navy had been destroyed. Its Air Force had no experienced pilots left. Its supply lines, stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, were systematically intercepted by American submarines. The Japanese response was the emergence of the kamikaze, the divine wind, a name taken from the typhoon that destroyed the Mongol fleet that attempted to invade Japan in the 13th century. From October 1944 onward, volunteer pilots, in many cases 18 or 20-year-old youths, university students with very few hours of flight experience, launched themselves in aircraft loaded with explosives against Allied ships. In Okinawa, between April and June 1945, kamikaze attacks sank 36 ships and damaged 368 more, killing 4,900 American sailors. Iwo Jima, February to March 1945. A volcanic island of 21 square kilometers, 70,000 American soldiers against 21,000 Japanese troops entrenched in a network of tunnels and bunkers that no previous bombing had been able to destroy. The battle lasted 36 days. The Americans lost 6,821 dead and 19,217 wounded. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, 216 were captured alive. The rest died in combat, in collapsed tunnels, or through suicide. The photograph by Corporal Joe Rosenthal, 6 Marines raising the American flag over Mount Suribachi on February 23rd became one of the most reproduced images of the 20th century. It was taken during a second flag raising, the first one being smaller, but it captured something real about the cost of that war in the Pacific, the smallest victory achieved at the highest price. Okinawa, the archipelago closest to the Japanese home islands, was the last great battle of the Pacific. It began on April 1st, 1945, with the largest amphibious landing of that war. 60,000 American soldiers on the first day against a Japanese garrison of 77,000 men plus militias made up of 39,000 armed civilians. The battle lasted 82 days. The Americans suffered 12,520 dead and 36,631 wounded. The Japanese lost between 77,000 and 110,000 military personnel killed. The number of civilian deaths caused by the fighting, crossfire, and suicides induced by Japanese propaganda, which promised American massacres, ranges between 42,000 and 150,000. It was clear what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would mean. American estimates for Operation Olympic, the assault on the island of Kyushu, planned for November 1945, calculated between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties. Japanese casualties would have been incomparably higher. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, the director of the Manhattan Project, Julius Robert Oppenheimer, witnessed the first nuclear detonation in history at the site called Trinity. The explosion was equivalent to 20 kilotons of TNT. Oppenheimer, according to witnesses, murmured in Sanskrit, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 hours, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped an enriched uranium bomb called Little Boy on Hiroshima. The detonation occurred at an altitude of 600 meters in order to maximize the area of destruction. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people died at the moment of the explosion, many literally vaporized. By the end of 1945, total deaths related to the Hiroshima bomb were estimated between 90,000 and 166,000 people. On August 9th, a second aircraft, the Bockscar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, dropped a plutonium bomb called Fat Man on Nagasaki. The original target had been Kokura, but a cloud of smoke over the city concealed it. Nagasaki was the secondary target. Between 40,000 and 80,000 people died immediately. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke by radio for the first time to the Japanese people. His voice, which none of his subjects had ever heard before, the voice of the living God, announced the surrender. "The war situation," said the emperor in the elevated language of the imperial court, which many Japanese did not fully understand, "has not necessarily developed in Japan's favor." On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the formal surrender document. General Douglas MacArthur received it on behalf of the Allied powers. The Second World War had ended. The world that remained. Consequences and legacy. 60 million dead, perhaps 70. The figures change depending on the source and the method of calculation, and each variation hides millions of individual stories that can never be recovered. The Soviet Union lost between 26 and 27 million people, soldiers and civilians alike. Every Soviet family had a dead relative, a disabled person, someone who never returned. In the cities after the war, the mutilated, the so-called samovars, the men without legs who moved around on wheeled boards, were so numerous and so uncomfortable for the state's heroic narrative that Stalin ordered them removed from the streets of Moscow and sent to institutions far from public view. The war had produced too much horror to fit into a parade of medals. China lost between 20 million and, according to more recent estimates by Chinese historians, up to 50 million people between the war with Japan and the consequences of occupation. The exact number is impossible to verify, given the collapse of records and the scale of displacement, between 50 and 90 million refugees. Poland lost 17% of its pre-war population. 6 million Polish citizens died, including almost the entirety of its 3.5 million Jews. Warsaw was 85% destroyed. The country that emerged in 1945 was physically and demographically different from the one that existed in 1939. Germany lost between 5 and 7 million military personnel and civilians. In addition, 12 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other Eastern European countries in the months following the war, in the largest forced population expulsion in European history. Many died in the process. Japan lost between 2 and 3 million military personnel and hundreds of thousands of civilians, including the victims of the firebombing of Tokyo, where, on the night of March 9, 1945, 300 B-29 bombers dropped 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs on the capital, killing between 80,000 and 100,000 people, as well as the dead of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But figures, as Vasily Grossman said, are dangerously numbing. What the war did to the world was more than destruction. It was a total reconfiguration. The political map of the planet was remade. The European colonial system, already in decline, collapsed. The independence movements of Asia and Africa, India, Indonesia, Indochina, Kenya, Nigeria, found in the war both proof of the vulnerability of European powers and the political vocabulary of rights with which to argue their cause. When the British who had fallen to the Japanese in Singapore returned to liberate their colonies, the moral authority of the empire was no longer what it had been. African soldiers who had fought under the French or British flag returned to their countries asking why the self-determination they had defended in Europe did not apply to them. The United Nations, whose charter was signed on June 26, 1945, in San Francisco by 50 countries, was an attempt to create an international order that would prevent the repetition of the conflict. The League of Nations, which had failed between the two wars, had been an institution without real power. The United Nations, at least in theory, would have the capacity to intervene. Stalin vetoed the creation of a permanent general staff that would have given real strength to the organization, and the Security Council became paralyzed by Cold War tensions as soon as the conflict began. But the institutional architecture it produced, the International Criminal Tribunal system that emerged from Nuremberg, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, and the system of specialized agencies that included the WHO and UNESCO, was a direct consequence of the war. The Nuremberg trials, which began on November 20, 1945, and concluded on October 1, 1946, were a legal milestone. For the first time in history, political and military leaders were tried for crimes against humanity before an international tribunal. 12 of the 24 main defendants were sentenced to death. Hermann Göring committed suicide with cyanide in his cell 2 hours before his scheduled execution. The concept of war crime ceased to be a vague aspiration and became established international law. In Tokyo, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo Trials, which lasted from 1946 to 1948, tried 28 Japanese military and political leaders. 7 were executed. The process was more controversial than Nuremberg. The exclusion of the emperor and those responsible for biological research units such as Unit 731 generated criticism that continues to this day. But it established the principle that atrocities committed under military orders did not exempt individuals from personal responsibility. The Marshall Plan, announced by American Secretary of State George Marshall in June 1947, injected $13 billion into the reconstruction of Western Europe. It was partly generosity and partly strategic calculation. A devastated and economically desperate Western Europe was fertile ground for communism. The reconstruction financed by the United States created the markets that the American economy needed and the allies that American diplomacy required. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones. In 1949, the 3 Western zones were unified into the Federal Republic of Germany. The Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic. Berlin, located within East German territory, was likewise divided. The wall that physically separated it from 1961 to 1989 became the most concrete symbol of the Cold War that the Second World War had created. Japan, occupied by American forces under the command of General MacArthur, was transformed from its foundations. A constitution imposed by the occupiers in 1947, which the Japanese called the MacArthur Constitution, expressly prohibited the use of war as an instrument of national policy. Article 9, which renounced maintaining offensive military forces, was the direct product of the moral shock caused by both Japanese atrocities and the atomic bombs. Japan built upon that renunciation one of the most successful economies of the 20th century. The atomic bomb was the most ambivalent legacy of the war. The Manhattan Project, the research program that involved more than 130,000 people in secret facilities from Los Alamos to Oak Ridge at a cost of nearly $2 billion $1945, concentrated the greatest accumulation of scientific talent in history toward a single objective. Albert Einstein had written to President Roosevelt in August 1939 warning that Germany might be developing a nuclear weapon. Germany did in fact have its own program, but it never came close to producing a bomb. Its physicists, among other obstacles, made fundamental errors in calculating critical mass. When the Allied intelligence team known as Alsos arrived in Germany in 1945, they found a program years behind the American one. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima, and Nagasaki ended the war with Japan, probably saving millions of lives in a land invasion that would have been devastating for both sides. At the same time, they inaugurated the nuclear age, with all its implications for the following half-century. The arms race, mutually assured destruction, and the nuclear terror that shaped world politics until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and continues to shape it today. Historian John Keegan, in his analysis of the legacy of the war, offered an observation that has survived the passing of decades. The legacy of the First World War was to convince the victors, though not the defeated, that the costs of war exceeded its benefits. The legacy of the Second World War was to convince both victors and defeated alike of the same thing. Germany, which had created the greatest continental conflict twice in 31 years, built after 1945 a stable democracy that transformed violence as an instrument of politics into something unthinkable. Japan did the same. The European powers, France and Great Britain, retained the desire for small colonial wars for a few more years, but the era of large-scale European conflict had ended. Why the most important? The question in the title demands an answer that is not merely rhetorical. There have been other great wars. The First World War killed 10 million soldiers and destroyed 4 empires. The Napoleonic Wars reorganized Europe and spread the principles of the French Revolution. The 30 Years' War destroyed 1/3 of the population in some regions of central Germany. There are ways to argue that any major conflict was the most important. But the Second World War was different in several ways that, taken together, place it in a distinct category. The first is its absolute scale: 60 or 70 million deaths in 6 years. The majority were civilians. This number has no precedent in human history. No previous war reaches it, nor does any recorded epidemic comparable in terms of speed and deliberate intent. The second is the deliberate nature of the crimes. The Holocaust was not a side consequence of the war, it was a programmatic objective of the regime that unleashed it, carried out using the instruments of the modern state: bureaucracy, railways, chemical industry, data processing, systematically applied to mass murder. The same applies in different degrees and with different ideological structures to Japanese crimes in China, to the German hunger plan, which deliberately killed millions of Soviet prisoners of war and the civilian population of besieged cities, and to the mass deportations carried out by Stalin's NKVD. The Second World War was the moment when modern states demonstrated that they could apply their entire organizational capacity to the extermination of entire populations. The third is the transformation of the international order that it produced. Before 1939, there existed a world of European empires and colonial powers that dominated approximately 75% of the planet. After 1945, that world had disappeared, not immediately, but the process was irreversible. The United Nations, the human rights system, modern international humanitarian law, and the prohibition of wars of aggression as a legal norm. All of this emerged directly from the catastrophe of 1939 to 1945. The fourth is the technology it produced or accelerated. Radar, modern computing. The first computers were built partly to decipher German Enigma codes and to calculate ballistic trajectories. Jet aviation, long-range ballistic missiles, wartime medicine that led to the development of modern antibiotics, nuclear energy. The war was the catalyst that compressed decades of technological development into 6 years and placed in humanity's hands instruments whose implications we are still trying to understand. The fifth is the division of the world into blocks that shaped the rest of the 20th century. The Cold War, with its 45 years of nuclear tension and its proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Angola, and Afghanistan, was the direct result of how the Second World War ended, with the Soviet Union and the United States as the only superpowers, confronting each other over the ruins of a devastated Europe. Without the Second World War, the world of the 21st century would be unrecognizable. There is no way to know whether it would have been better or worse. Historical counterfactuals are philosophical traps. What we do know is that the world that exists today was shaped more than by any other single event by that conflict. That is what makes a war the most important in human history, not only the scale of the destruction, but the depth of the transformation. The Second World War did not merely destroy what existed before. It created the conditions for almost everything that came afterward. The weight of memory. Why do we keep returning? A few decades after the end of the war, historian Anthony Beevor observed something that remains true. No other period in history offers such a rich source for the study of moral dilemmas, individual and collective tragedy, the corruption of political power, ideological hypocrisy, the selfishness of commanders, betrayal, perversity, self-sacrifice, sadism, and unpredictable compassion. And he added a warning that deserves attention. There is a real danger that the Second World War will become the automatic point of reference for every contemporary crisis. Comparing 9/11 with Pearl Harbor, or comparing any contemporary dictator with Hitler, is not merely a historical inaccuracy. It can produce the wrong strategic response because contexts are different, and imperfect analogies often lead to mistaken decisions. The 10 years that followed the end of the war were years of silence and omissions. Holocaust survivors found no audience willing to listen to them. Europe wanted to rebuild itself, not examine its own guilt. Veterans from all armies remained silent about what they had seen and done, sometimes for decades. Japanese war crimes in China were absent from international public debate for generations, partly because the Cold War made Japan too valuable an ally to subject its past to rigorous examination. Trials, memorials, museums, academic and popular history, all of this slowly built a collective memory that is never static. In Germany, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the process of coming to terms with the past, was a generational process that included crises, debates, and ruptures. It was the generation of Germans born after 1945 that, in the 1960s, confronted their parents with questions that had never been asked before. The historian Karl Jaspers distinguished between criminal, political, moral, and metaphysical guilt. categories that allowed responsibility to be analyzed without simplification. In Japan, the process was different and more incomplete. The denial of atrocities in textbooks and the debates over politicians' visits to the Yasukuni Shrine, where among those enshrined are 14 convicted Class A war criminals, continue to produce diplomatic friction with China and Korea decades later. In the Soviet Union and later in Russia, the Great Patriotic War was transformed into a founding myth of the state, one that has oscillated between recognition of the real sacrifice made and the political instrumentalization of that sacrifice. Stalin's crimes, the pact with Hitler, the mass deportations, the murder of Polish officers at Katyn, the deliberate abandonment of the populations of the Baltic countries to German occupation remained unspeakable for decades within the official Soviet narrative. The memory of the Second World War is also the battlefield where struggles over the present are fought. When governments invoke the Munich appeasement policy to justify military interventions, they are using history as a rhetorical weapon. When 21st-century neo-Nazi movements rewrite the Holocaust or deny its scale, they are waging a war against memory that has concrete political consequences. The real danger is not that we remember too much, it is that we remember incorrectly.